Hello, everybody. Come on in to the Zoom room. Hello, welcome. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 881st New Social Environment. I am Carolyn, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Antonio Sergio Bessa, Alan Frame, Leslie Cozzi, and Ksenia M. Soboleva. We are thrilled to welcome poet Tommye Blount here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. Antonio Sergio Bessa is Chief Curator Emeritus at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. Alan Frame is a photographer and writer based in New York and represented by Gitterman Gallery. His books include Innamorato, Fever, and Detour. He has curated numerous exhibitions. Dr. Leslie Cozzi is the curator of prints, drawings, and photographs at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she is responsible for the museum's post-1900 works on paper and has organized numerous exhibitions, including Darrel Ellis' Regeneration. And our host today, New York-based writer and art historian, Dr. Ksenia M. Soboleva, specializes in queer art and culture. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU. She's a regular contributor to the Brooklyn Rail, which we are very lucky for. And thank you all so much for joining. I'll turn it over to Ksenia.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for making this possible. It's always such a pleasure to be here. I think we can get the slideshow going so people can see the work. I remember a few years ago, a friend telling me that they had started working on the Darrel Ellis archive. It must have been maybe 2016, and it was in conjunction with the Osmos magazine. Drew Sawyer wrote the essay for that magazine, and I stopped by the space and I saw some of the work, and I remember realizing that Darrel had been in the Witnesses exhibition curated by Nan Golden in 1989. And at the time I was doing research for my dissertation, which was set during the AIDS crisis. And it was a really sweet serendipity that then Candice Madey Gallery started to represent the Darrel Ellis estate, just because I'm a fan of anything Candice does, and I think we all are. And so I felt very fortunate to have been on this journey of, I hate the word rediscovery, but really returning to Darrel Ellis's work and disseminating it. And I reviewed the show for the Rail, and if you want to read my thoughts, I encourage you to check it out. But really, I'm super excited to be here with three people that can speak to Darrel Ellis better than I can. So Alan, Sergio, and Leslie, thank you so much for joining today. And my first question is really, I wanted to ask, how did the exhibition come about, and how did the idea for Darrel Ellis exhibition land at the Baltimore Museum of Art, after which it then traveled to the Bronx Museum?
Well, I think, I don't know if I think we all probably will have a similar but slightly different version of answering this question. I became familiar with Darrel Ellis's work through Alan, who has been stewarding the estate for several decades now. Alan is a friend from former lives. And I think as curators, we listen to artists. And when Alan said, "This is interesting, you should go see it," I went and saw it at Osmos. And that kind of started for me a process of discovery of the work. The Baltimore Museum of Art acquired two works. And then from there, we were sort of interested in giving it a broader platform and of potentially working on an exhibition, and it was through Alan that I became introduced to Sergio, and the kind of collaboration and partnership grew between us really through the work, I would say. I don't know if Alan or Sergio, you want to kind of embroider more on that story and how it has traveled.
Sergio? Yeah, I'll just add that what Leslie said applies to me also. I was introduced to the work by Alan. And the interesting thing was that I just want to make this clear. I had left the museum, the Bronx Museum, at the end of 19. And I don't remember, Alan, when you invited me to come see the show at Osmos, but it was pretty much around that time, end of 19 or early 20. And I thought I was just going to see a show, and then Alan said, well, I think you should curate something. And then, long story short, he put me in touch with Leslie, and the collaboration started. So I think it all goes back to Alan and the amazing stewardship that he has had over the years in trying to make this work more visible.
And I want to mention former director of the Bronx Museum, Holly Block, who was aware of Darrel's work through the Witnesses show at Artist Space in the late 80s, and as the director of art in general throughout the 90s, who then came to the Bronx Museum. She had invited me to curate a show of his work in 1996, and I thought that after that show, which was reviewed in the New York Times, that something would happen, and a gallery would show up and take the work off my hands and so on. And for all sorts of different reasons, that didn't happen. So I'm so grateful now that the work is being seen in this way and being exposed in this way. And especially to Leslie and Sergio, it's not just, they're very careful and highly considered curating, but also their writing, because that's something that's happened with this museum show and with the visual aids monograph, is that these really terrific scholars and curators have addressed the work and its complexity and written really outstanding essays about it. So I encourage everyone to get the new monograph that's come out with the Bronx Museum show, and the monograph that Visual Aids produced 2 years ago. They're both really outstanding.
I agree. I read all of them. And traveling from the Baltimore Museum to the Bronx Museum, the exhibition grew, I think, 3 times. It's 3 times the size. What were the kind of choices that you had to make around that? And were there things that you wish you could have included that didn't make it in?
Leslie, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I definitely, when we started thinking about the show, we had only just started to go through the archives. And so when we both first started talking about it, we sort of had in mind a much smaller footprint, or I guess the sort of footprint that we had at the BMA. And then as Sergio and Alan and Candice and I were sort of, and I should say our conservation colleagues at the BMA, Linda Owen and Scott Homolka, we're going through all this material, we sort of realized the vastness and magnitude of it. And Sergio was really able to pivot and sort of change and really dedicate the entire space, or a much larger space at the Bronx than sort of what we were able to do at the BMA. We kind of have a pretty tight institutional planning phase. Once that footprint was set, that wasn't really something we could easily change. But in a way, I think, it created 2 complementary kind of dovetailed shows that each had their own emphasis. So the BMA show is sort of at the moment nested inside what is at the Bronx. I think at the BMA, we were able to sort of use the specificity and the focus to make it a kind of jewel-like presentation and to really focus on technique and the historicity of the work, that sort of connection that Darrel really palpably felt to the 19th century. And it was actually situated at the BMA in our 19th century galleries, or late 19th, early 20th century galleries, I should say, what we call the cone wing. And then for Sergio, he was able to create something really expansive, and you get a sense of the breadth of Darrel's practice. And I think, you know, yeah, Sergio can talk a little bit more about how he opened it up.
Yeah, I felt, I think one main thing was the fact that Darrel was born in the Bronx. And over the years working in the Bronx Museum, I always felt that it's a point of pride to kind of do this kind of research and go deeper in the research. So as we are developing the project, and Leslie came up with the checklist, and I realized I was still in the process of getting to understand the work. It was very helpful to read the notebooks, and in the notebooks, at some point, he spells out his vision that he wanted, because Darrel had just a few opportunities to show his work in galleries, and I think I hope he would be very pleased to see what we accomplished, Leslie, because in his notebooks, he has this dream of showing the photographs together with drawings and sketches and this and that. So in a sense, I just follow, his vision at the Bronx Museum. That's what I wanted to. So we have, for example, right now we are looking at a cluster of photographs based on Family Dog. And I think in the beginning that Leslie, this image totally escaped us. And later I could find this very kind of mysterious image, and then I thought it was very interesting, and then all of a sudden I realized that there were so many, and it should have an importance related to that, and there was an importance. We spoke to his sister, and this was a beloved dog in the family, and there was a story in the family how this dog basically saved an uncle's life, and so. Anyways, everything with Darrel had a lot of meaning kind of encapsulated in his choices. And I think to be able to do these clusters, like the dog, his sister, his mother, his grandparents, I think it just talks a lot about his for lack of a better word, his obsession with a few images. And anyways, so we can talk more about all this, but I think that was sort of the departure point.
Yeah, the notebooks are really incredible, and a selection of them is on view in the exhibition as well. And you can really tell that Darrel had an investment in keeping a record of his practice. I want to talk about that more, but I also want to return to the technical aspect of the work, because I remember when I first saw it in 2016, I didn't really know what I was looking at, and I actually thought that Darrel had started in photography and then moved on to painting, and it's really through the show that I actually realized that he started in painting. And then he inherited this collection of negatives from his father, who was killed by the police before Darrel was born, the day before he was supposed to report for service, because he had apparently enrolled to be a police officer. But he was also a photographer, and Darrel inherited the negatives, and what he did was essentially project those on irregular sculptural surfaces and then rephotograph it. So when you see these, for those of you who haven't seen this in person, or like me didn't know what they were looking at technically, oftentimes when it looks like pieces have been chopped off from negatives, like negatives have been cut into, that's actually not the case. It's because it's a photograph of a projection, if I'm describing it correctly. And what I think is really thrilling about this exhibition as well is that you have exhibited some of the technical tools that Darrel used, or I actually don't know if those were the exact, or if you found like similar ones that he would use.
The projector, there is a projector and a camera setup that are not his. We thought we might have identified his actual projector, and that did not come to pass. So thanks to the help of our conservators, we created a kind of historical recreation using a enlarger that we had bought off eBay and a camera that belonged to one of my colleagues. But it gives you a sense exactly of this really kind of enigmatic working process that brings together sculpture and photography and drawing and painting in such interesting ways.
Are there still mysteries about the work that you're trying to figure out, or do you have?
I think, there's definitely a lot we don't know. I mean, even just creating the checklist and working through the dates, there were lots of emails back and forth between Sergio and Alan and myself and Candice. And we should also mention Kyle Croft, who was the sort of the key contributor and editor for the Visual Aids publication. Just really like trying to do that archaeology and understand what the sequencing of certain images was, the relationship between the originals, the dating. I mean, I think in the BMA checklist, there was one work that Darrel had actually dated. So I think a lot of mysteries remain.
And
sorry,
can I interject? One mystery to me is, you said that he took up photography when he found his father's photographs in 1981, but he actually had begun to use photography before that, just photographing his sister with a camera, but when he applied to the residency at PS1 in 1979, he had that residency for 2 years with James Wincey. They applied with a proposal that had to do with rephotographing, that creating this kind of distortion through photography. And he was very invested for some reason at that young age of 21 or 22 in creating not just traditional photographs, but very innovative experimental photographs or conceptual photographs. And without having his father's photographs yet to rephotograph, he distorted portraits and other kinds of pictures, and a lot of those early photographs are lost. But there's a photograph that I took of him in his studio at the Whitney program in 1981 that has a lot of them in the background, and you can sort of see this whole array of black and white experimental photographs from that. And my question is, why? Because he was constantly sketching figures, in bars and on the subway, his family at home, etc., and doing a lot of figurative drawing and painting. And why was he suddenly so interested in making innovative photographs?
I think
just to add to what I think what Alan said is very important, and for everybody pretty much to understand that he basically came up with his process of rephotography before he began to work with his father's negatives. And for me, that's very telling. You first kind of articulate or you build your language, and then you find your subject matter, and then you apply that language to hone in some other instance, and you develop further. So it's such a perfect match. And just to go back to what Leslie was saying about the setup of the camera, I find it very helpful. I just gave a tour last Saturday to a small group, and I was pointing to people that nothing in Darrel's visual is gratuitous. Everything has a reason to be. So he's not someone that says, oh, I'm going to make this curlicue here. You know, the curlicue is there for a reason. And I'm saying this about the trapezoid shape that you see repeated in some of the images, drawings and paintings and so forth. And that's because the angle of the camera in photographing the projection on the table. So, and you know, he doesn't duck that. He doesn't avoid that distortion. He incorporates that. And I think that's really wonderful. And I agree with Leslie. I think we just scratched the surface. And I'm hoping that, you know, not next year, but in 10, 20 years, someone else is going to do a really wonderful new show with new discoveries. And I think there is quite a lot to discover about this man. So.
Yeah. Yes, and everybody looking for dissertation topics. Here you go.
There must be a dissertation on Darrel Ellis. The works.
I know of one. We know of one, but I'm hoping that there will be more.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think there's something very queer about this desire to distort, right? And from there's one interview with Darrel Ellis by David Hirsch that's in one of the books or in both of the books. And you know, at some point he's talking about being really inspired by the history of European painting, like Cézanne and Bonnat, and then slowly becoming, you know, painfully aware that this was a history that had left him out. And you can kind of tell that he's self-conscious about this fact. And at some point, I think he even says that he's embarrassed. And I think that there's something to say for, you know, if he's creating his own narrative, then it's going to be inherently distorted. It's like Sarah Ahmed said, that we have to experience disorientation in order to orient ourselves. So when I look at these, I always think of that. Alan, you, in your essay, there is a really wonderful phrase where you talk about the model talks back, and it's in reference to the Witnesses show, in which Darrel contributed 2 works, which were 2 paintings, one of a photograph that Hujar had taken of him, and then another of the photograph that Mapplethorpe had taken of him. And I love this idea of the model talks back, especially the queer male model. And you were friends with Darrel. Do you think that this is something that he was looking to explore further?
Definitely. And all the attention that he got through that Artist Best show made him want to investigate that idea more, and that led to a whole series of self-portraits as personas from other people's photographs, including mine. But you know, in the Hirsch interview, he talks about wanting to resist the frozen images of Hujar and Mapplethorpe. And I think he meant not just frozen as in decisive moment, you know, that kind of precise moment of photography that's so heralded, but frozen in terms of a coldness, probably, that he wanted to bring more of a sense of life and feeling into the photographs. I mean, they're both, you know, sort of like, I mean, Mapplethorpe's is a studio portrait. Hujar, you know, used a studio at home. So there's a kind of objectivity in the apprehension of Darrel as a subject, and through reinterpreting himself and making paintings himself, he was, you know, able to infuse those images with more, and I would say more sense of contingency, and there were so many contingencies in his life, and that's one beauty of the exhibition now, is that there's so many series that show the contingencies of media, of different handling, you know, from photography to drawing to painting and so on, that you kind of see all of that unfolding and mediation going on. But in the case of, Hujar and Mapplethorpe photographed him in the same year, in 1981, which is the year that I met him and began to photograph him as well. And he was particularly uncomfortable with Mapplethorpe's session. That is just a sort of bust portrait from the chest up. And I suppose that Mapplethorpe wanted a nude and he wasn't interested in doing that. And somebody in the chat said something about there being role models to him, in the sense that they both had followings and were art world figures using photography in the downtown scene. They definitely modeled a kind of aspiration. But in terms of the kind of photography they represented, which is, a very kind of uncontextual portrait mode, or, more of a studio portrait mode, I think that what he found in his father's work, particularly in all the pictures of family in domestic situations, was the social context around the figures. They're figures in a room, they're not portraits. And I think it's worth saying also that even though he was so invested at the time that he found his father's work, he was so invested in innovating in photography, when he saw his father's work, he just submitted to the richness of them and created, in the first few years, just these kind of literal interpretations of them. He didn't immediately try to experiment with those photographs, and it was not for about 6 years until he did that.
I wanted to just embroider one thing onto what the beautiful kind of explication that Alan just gave about this use of the term frozen, because to me, I think that's really significant and interesting. And I think that quote appears in the Witnesses catalog. I resist the frozen images that Hujar and Mapplethorpe made. They haunt me.
Thanks for that correction. Yeah.
But it is interesting to think about his approach to seriality, and the reason we sort of use this term regeneration, because on the one hand, I think it's also a way of when we think of frozen images, I think, and in the history of photography in general, there's this association with death, with the kind of mortuary portrait, with one of the images that we included in the catalog was this really beautiful James Van Der Zee image of a young boy in a casket, and so I think he was also thinking about the way photography has functioned historically, and the way in which seriality, which was in that moment really being thought of in terms of kind of media culture, could also be reframed in a larger manner of speaking that kind of related back to the origins of photography itself. I mean, he was a really brilliant theorist, I think, in a way that is one of the sort of lessons of the exhibition and of the research that has been done on him.
And in that Witnesses show, at the Artist Space show, he showed his own interpretations next to the photographs that they had given him that he owned. He got, he framed them and showed them alongside his own work, which just created, it showed the viewer exactly what the contrast was, what he was bringing to those photographs.
And also by that time, both Mapplethorpe and Hujar had passed away, right?
Yes, right, exactly.
So there was also this heightened sense of mortality, and also just the language that we use around photography, to shoot. And I think Susan Sontag said to photograph someone is to kill them. I have a very nerdy question as we're looking through these images, which is about the framing. How did you decide on which frames to use and then which works to leave unframed? Improvised?
Sergio, you're muted.
as far as I can remember, Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think only one of the bedroom scenes is unframed, but pretty much everything is framed. And as our checklist kind of was growing in number, and I was asking works in private collections, I asked them to match the kind of frame that Candice had already done. So there is only a few frames that are white because it was already as such, and then everything that we produced for the exhibition was, you know, we try actually to use the same frame just to give more sort of a uniformity to the whole presentation.
Yeah, and I think also there's just a sort of kind of museological set of decisions that gets made that isn't necessarily in reference to the specific work itself, but you know, like at the BMA, we almost uniformly frame works on paper, right? Because their surfaces are delicate, they're more subject to fading and degradation due to light. Whereas, you know, with works on canvas, you have a little bit more latitude. And so there were some interesting examples of shaped canvases that we could leave unframed, so that you could really get a sense of the kind of geometric or kind of organic play that Ellis was making with the surface of the shaping of the canvas itself.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask, and this speaks to the show that Alan and Sergio curated at Candice Madey Gallery, which was really bringing together a large community of queer artists that were either friends with Darrel or just roamed the same art world. And it was a beautiful show. I think over 70 works.
100 works and 75 artists, something like that.
100 works. And I'm curious, what was the role of friendship in Darrel's life? I guess, Alan, you can probably speak to that better than anyone, but I'd love to hear from all of you.
Yeah. You know, when I was writing the essay for the museum catalog, which is a biographical essay, I was really struck by the number of different scenes that Darrel was a part of. He grew up in the Bronx, went to high school in Chelsea. He was part of the Bronx fashion moda scene. He was, you know, did a residency for 2 years at PS1 and met those international artists there and other American artists. He went immediately from there to the Whitney Independent Program for a year and was around those artists. He was living in the East Village when I met him and already knew, you know, a number of people that I knew who were artists in that scene. He worked as a security guard at MoMA, and a lot of those guards were also artists, and he met those curators. I mean, he really had a very varied, broad social world, and was able to create, had the kind of personality that outgoing enough to cross all of those divides and relate to all of those different people. And he also taught through the Whitney program. I mean, not the Whitney program, the Whitney Museum. He taught in the schools. And yet, you know, writing this, I realized that his closest friends were very few. And in the 80s, I would say, he spent a lot more time just in the studio, and part of that was, you know, the economics of prioritizing art materials over, you know, drinks at a bar, but also just his dedication to his work and his obsession with creating it. I mean, when he died, the amount of work that we found in his apartment was staggering. And even though we were friends, I had not seen much of the production of his last few years because he was at home making it. And unfortunately, I feel like the two closest friends both had died by 96. Miguel Ferrando and Richard Brensenhoff died in 95 and 96. So even though I knew them also, but not as well as I knew Darrel, they were not there to, to tell me things that I didn't know and tell me about experiences that I didn't know.
I want to add something to what Alan is saying, because I feel, one thing that is so touching about this work is his regard for family. Ksenia, you mentioned that he was perhaps feeling out. You mentioned just a few minutes ago that he was feeling out of that history of 19th century. But remember, he was also feeling out of a family because he grew up without a father who had been killed brutally. And he was also growing up within a family that no longer had those rituals that he saw in the photographs of his father. So there was, I think there's something there that I think it's extremely touching. I mentioned this several times, but I think it's interesting that 2 exhibitions that he did in the early 80s, the titles are Drawings After My Father's Photographs or something like that. So he doesn't try to aestheticize or to make it more conceptual. He's just very straightforward for that. And I want to say, Alan, just to tease here, that this kind of love for the family, he also might have had with his close friends, because when we did the panel at the Bronx Museum with you and Laurie, I think it was that day or some other panel, Susan Spencer Crowe told us that when Darrel was in the hospital and he was mortified and petrified that, he had AIDS. I don't know what was the stage, but he finally called Susan. He didn't want to call his family, didn't want to call anyone. He called Susan, who had been a good friend, and they collaborated. And she went to see him, and she said, "You have to let me call a couple of your friends." And he said, "Yes, call Alan and call John Ahern." And Susan said that both of you came and that John Ahern gave him a haircut. And I have to tell you that story. I got home. And
just to give you a minute, Sergio. So John knew Darrel from Fashion Moda in the Bronx.
yeah,
and there was a portrait that he did, and that's in the book, and it was in our show at Candice Madey.
Yeah, but that's such an amazing, strong story of friendship. And do you remember when Leslie and I began to research for the exhibition, we went to see John. And John was John is very, very self-effacing, very cool. He just, oh yeah, Darrel, good friend, and so forth. And he had some beautiful works by Darrel, but that dimension of their friendship never came across from John. It came through Susan. And he probably had a few friends, but I would think like very strong kind of a rapport. I think especially with Miguel Ferrando, because we saw some letters that he writes from Germany to Miguel. Do you remember?
Yeah.
So anyways, but yes, Ksenia, to go back to your original question, I think the exhibition was a lot about that, about a group of artists working in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, that it was not so much about, the 15 minutes of fame, but it was really kind of a different kind of MO, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were so many artists who are now well known that he knew, whose paths he crossed. from PS1, from social scenes, etc. But Miguel was in high school with him, and Miguel was a family from the Dominican Republic, and the parents would go back in the winter and leave Miguel the apartment, and Darrel crashed there and spent some months living there. And they, shared, they had so much in common and shared a lot, like their whole practice was similar, a lot of their interests and so on. So that was a particularly close relationship. And what we're looking at on the screen is, on the left, it's Darrel's photographs of Miguel with Miguel's boyfriend, Todd. Darrel posing them to use as a source for a series of Pietà paintings and drawings that he did, in which Miguel is in drag and Todd is wearing a sort of sailor cap and shorts. And Miguel is clutching him in a kind of Pietà position.
And was he involved in AIDS activism, ACT UP, for example? Because for
no, he was not.
And there's also real risk, particularly for queer people of color, to be arrested, of course.
Yeah, it's hard for people to realize the stigmatization around AIDS, even in the early 90s. And when Darrel called us from the hospital, he was sharing with us for the first time that he had HIV and that it was in an advanced state, even though he had been in the Witnesses show. But I was in the Witnesses show too. It was like a group of artists that Nan Goldin knew, who she invited to make work about the response to that pandemic, and included some people who had already died. So the fact that you were in it was not necessarily an indicator that you had HIV. And Darrel became the sort of poster boy for that show, and that his Mapplethorpe painting was used heavily in all the press. And yet, I thought, and other people assumed, that he was negative. So it was a shock that he hadn't shared that to me, with a friend like myself. And that just speaks to the incredible stigma that was still attached to it, even for a gay man in New York City.
Yeah. And we know he was already concerned about being infected by 1983, because he writes in one of his notebooks. So,
returning to the notebooks, how did you make the selection for which ones to include in the exhibition? And do you imagine all the notebooks at some point becoming a book?
I hope so. Yeah, we had a great addition to the team, which was Kyle Croft from Visual Aids. And Kyle had transcribed pretty much everything in the notebooks. So that gave us a very good basis. And the selection kind of evolved over time. In the beginning, I thought, it's important for people to just see the amount of notebooks, which is over 50. But then as we begin to refine the layout and the process, I thought it would be interesting to show those notebooks that had a specific relationship to some groupings. And so we end up just showing like maybe 4, if I'm not wrong, 4 of the notebooks. And they are all related to specific points in the exhibition. So there is one that opens in the page showing a sketch of his sister, Lori, during Easter weekend. And then there is another one that it's his annotation of an I Ching session in 1983. And I think there is another one. There is a couple more, I can't remember, but they're related to he is spelling out his process. So it was, we had to kind of narrow down quite a lot. But we hope, and we've been in conversation with the state to do a publication about the notebooks. And I think particularly for young artists, I think it would be a really fantastic revelatory kind of document.
Eleanor, Leslie, do you have anything to add?
I don't think actually had any notebook pages at the BMA because we just didn't have the space. So we did have some ephemera, we had some early drawings, and we had material related to the contact sheets that he made from his father's negatives and sort of showing, prints of his father's negatives that he had made, actual vintage prints by his father, as well as a kind of a state print of what what an image that his father hadn't printed but that Darrel used might have looked like, to try to kind of give people a sense of the difference in tone between Darrel's outlook and also his way of making photographs. I mean, he just printed them much darker. He had a really different kind of aesthetic. It was much more noir. And the kind of sunny post-war, baby boom optimism that his father was working within.
I'm also curious, aside from, his expressed interest in 19th century painting, European painting, who were some of his own contemporaries that maybe weren't even necessarily his friends, that you think his work was in dialogue with, or that he was informed by? And particularly, were there other artists of color that he was looking at?
Well, there's an interesting passage in the journals when he's teaching at the Art in the Schools, the Arts Reach program that the Whitney Museum ran in the 80s, where he sort of realizes that the syllabus he had been handed was all white, and he kind of creates an alternative list of artists, and it's it's a lot of powerhouses in the Black arts movement that have been showcased in important exhibitions, at the Brooklyn Museum and at other venues in the past few years. So at this point, I think it's a cast of characters that we know. And he also, he talks about James Van Der Zee, he talks about Gordon Parks. But I think for him, I mean, he was literally doing the research and kind of finding this material before it had been as widely published as it is now. And people are making really interesting comments about Delacroix and Rodin and Vuillard. Certainly the 19th century. I mean, there's this one really interesting passage in the notebooks where he tries to come up with a system of adding artists' birth and death dates together, and to use that as the basis of a kind of formal invention. And it's like unclear exactly what he's trying to accomplish, but he's he was really thinking clearly about the 19th century, and he was also creating an alternative canon of Black 20th century artists. But to me, there's a real removal, and something that Alan and Sergio and I have talked about before, between his work and the work his contemporaries were doing. There's just a sense of decorum that I feel like you don't necessarily see amongst the people that he would have been working amongst. Even if I think you could make, we talked about John Ahern. Certainly, there was a kind of portraiture of the community that was happening in that practice. So there are certainly, I think, moments of mutual dialogue, but I think when he was thinking about interlocutors, they were very often long deceased ones.
Yeah. And it's interesting also, Leslie, that when he looks at contemporary art, he looks with a very critical eye. For example, there is a couple of mention to Frank Stella, and how upset he is that Frank Stella is having yet another show at MoMA. And he goes on and on about how Frank Stella formalism is just so devoid of any meaning. And I think those are very important notes, because it just shows the place that form and had a very significant place in his work. There is another note that it's very short, that he makes a reference about going to see an exhibition at, I think it's at Staats Gallery of the Storm Twins. And it's a very briefly annotated thing. And my hunch was that probably someone said, oh, there is this guy doing experimental photography. And he went there and he just goes, it's nothing what I'm doing. So it's very interesting. His rapport with the sort of the contemporary is kind of at a distance, as Leslie said.
Mm-hmm.
Although he knew everybody, and he was connected to everyone. And so, Alan, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I agree that like really the strongest influences are 19th century. But I think that some conceptual photographers, conceptual artists who use photography, like John Baldessari, would have been people he was familiar with, and possibly even Robert Heineken. Makita Best in her essay talks about the importance of the exhibition photography and sculpture that was at MoMA around 1970. And that's a little bit early for Darrel, but the book, the catalog exists. He worked at MoMA, so... But also just he knew so many artists of his own time. He knew Dawood Bey. He knew Fred Wilson, Whitfield Lavelle, Jules Allen, Joe Louis. I think he knew Carrie Mae Weems, later in the late 80s. Of course, he knew Nan Golden. He met all of my friends when we met in 1981. But yeah, in terms of, the strongest influence, I mean, Sergio in the book writes about the way that he synthesized the impact of the pictures generation and that conceptual postmodern approach with that current in photography that had to do with photographing friends and family, and yeah.
And there are other names that crop up. Like at one point in his notebooks, he talks about Carolee Schneemann, right? And there's like an interesting body of work that she does in the late 80s, where it's also photographs of her and her partner in bed. And so it's this kind of her own version of this sort of domestic scene. And there are others, there are a few other photographers that I wasn't honestly as familiar with that he kind of mentioned. So he was seeing everything. He was deeply knowledgeable. It just seemed like, when he's thinking about specific precedents to use, he's using Delacroix, he's using Vuillard. I mean, those are the models that he's adopting deliberately. But I don't think anything went in one ear and out the other. I think he was deeply aware and deeply cognizant of both his like colleagues that he was working with, as well as what was being shown in the galleries in New York in that moment.
And Alan, you traveled with Darrel to Europe, right?
I was already living in London. I was living there for 2 years, and he visited me for 2 weeks en route to Germany, where he was in a group show. And he and I both thought when we moved to Europe that we were moving permanently, like we wanted to. It was this romantic idea. I'm going to be an artist in exile. But he got to the venue in Germany way early, and they were stupefied and were just like, the show is not happening until whatever. You're not supposed to be here. So he went to Berlin, and he was taken in by this wonderful co-op of women who were really nice to him. And I've never been able to track them down. Hopefully somebody from that time will show up one of these days. But he had a really good experience. And then the show happened, and he went for that and ran out of money and had to ask his mother to send him money so he could come back home. And that's when he actually, when he got home again, is when he started doing that experimental photography again, first with his own pictures of family members in his mother's apartment, and then with his father's work, and was just prolific in that period from 87 to when he died.
So when you were in London together, did you get to witness his first encounter with certain works that he had only seen in images?
You know, more what I remember is just his reaction to meeting people, to friends of mine. You know, he was in the sketch mode, as he always was, just, you know, and I think of that obsessive sketch and drawing as sort of like people who photograph. You know, it's a way of dealing with a situation which you may be bored or restless because you're not really part of it, or you don't know these people so well, and you have something to do, which is sketch. So he sketched 3 different friends of mine. He went out to Streatham to have tea with my friend Brian Britton, an artist. He did go to the museums, and we were working on getting some of the curators in London to look at his work as well. He had just produced this book at the Lower East Side print shop, with the help of Susan Crowe and Joe Lewis. And he had that to show, but and he had picked up a German guy on the plane en route to London and brought him to my apartment, and the German guy stayed about a day, and then Darrel visited him when he got to Germany, but that was over pretty quickly.
Love that story. I wanted to save some space for anything that any of you might want to add before we move into questions. I'm happy to report that the show will be traveling after this to 2 more venues. I don't know if it's publicly announced yet. Leslie,
yes.
do you...
It is.
Yes.
Isn't it?
I'm muted. Yeah, I believe we have letter of intentions and or contract signed for everybody. So yeah, it's all public knowledge. The Milwaukee Art Museum in this fall, opening in October, and then the Columbia Museum of Art in South Carolina will be on view there starting in February of next year. So it's really
and it's going to be the same in size?
They will each be slightly different. The Milwaukee presentation will be similar to the Bronx, but not quite as large. And then the Columbia presentation will be more, it will be mostly the BMA checklist, minus 1 or 2, with 1 or 2 swaps.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. Really enjoyed it. And I think there are still so many new things to be discovered. We'll move into questions from here on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. It's been such a rich hour. So yes, we encourage anyone, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, or just raise your hand in your video. But I have one here from our friend GE, and I'm going to ask on his behalf. He's wondering, did Darrel's process help him maintain a certain distance and detachment from the reality he knew, his way of getting to know his subjects, even his family? These are for anyone.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm curious to see how Alan and Sergio would answer this. To me, I think that detachment was already palpably felt. So I'm not sure that the process helped him maintain it as much as allowed him to represent it and mediate it.
I think even though he had close relationships with his sisters, much less so with his brothers or his stepfather, and he had close relationship with his mother, that as the gay middle child in that family, the detachment was, an experience coming from childhood, that kind of alienation, sense of difference and detachment. And there was this point at which he moved back home in the mid-'80s, and his mother had left that stepfather, and she was single, and she and Darrel were both dating, and they could, laugh and exchange stories and were close in that way. And you see from his work that people were hanging out in her bedroom. You know, the other siblings would come in with their friends and so on. And there was this close family connection. And yet, I think that experience of being gay in that time and context was something that, you know, definitely created that kind of detachment and alienation that made it just sort of second nature to approach those images from another time with that kind of detachment.
Yeah, I don't know if I use this word detachment or alienation. I think for me, he strikes me as the typical case of a young man who finds refuge in art. So his sister, very young, he would just kind of made copies of the Archie books, Veronica and what's her name? And then he goes to high school, and we saw recently the sister of Miguel Ferrando brought to the Bronx Museum some drawings that he had made during high school of fashion, and they are hilarious. It's totally different of what we have in the galleries now. It's drawings based on illustrations that you could see in German magazines and so forth. So, you know, you can see like this kid growing up and kind of carrying with him this imaginary kind of universe with him. And then he has this opportunity to face his father's legacy, and that's when things become very, you know, very, very personal. So, but I wouldn't say alienation. I take issue with that. One thing, Ksenia was asking if anyone would bring something else. I would like to bring up the fact that, and you see that in the notebooks quite a lot, but Darrel was a very spiritual person, and very sophisticated. I don't know if he did yoga, I don't know if he had a guru or anything like that. But I apologize, someone is ringing here. I'm gonna let someone else talk, and I'm gonna.
Yeah, we'll return to Sergio. But thank you, GE, for that question. Thank you for your answers. Our next question is from Alice. I'll let you unmute here, and I can also pull up the image you're referring to, Alice. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. First, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. I'm learning so much, and it's just been so informative. So thank you. I had a question about one image. I don't know if did you say you were going to pull it up? Right. It was a father-son, what I would interpret it as a father-son. It wasn't that image. It was a photograph of, I don't know if you can find it. That was it. And I don't, you showed so many images, but I was particularly struck by this, having lost his father, I think you said before he was even born, and it's so tender. And yet you talk about his detachment, you know, it's almost as if he has two different emotional personalities. But I was so struck by the emotionality of this image. And I wondered if someone could perhaps tell us a little bit more.
I mean, I can take a stab at it. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Les.
Well, so this is a work in the BMA's collection. We understand it to be his grandfather, Thomas, which is interesting because it's, you know, that's the family name that recurs. His older brother was also named Thomas, and a cousin. I think it's a particularly interesting image because it's one of the, you know, there's certain patterns of distortions that you see throughout multiple different images. Like you'll see him using the same relief for different projections. But he doesn't actually use this particular idiosyncratic kind of slice relief very often. And it's interesting to think of it, you know, what's essentially creating that is a kind of, you know, you've got this kind of like wall, right? Like that's what's sort of creating this distortion in the center of that kind of step removal of the central figure.
I don't what do you have a sense of what year this is?
Around 1990.
I mean, the image itself.
Oh, the image itself
is
much,
yeah,
or early 50s, probably before his father died. So yeah, we think most of these images are kind of the source images are around between 1950 and 1958 when his father died.
It's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it before, but it's very Hockney-esque.
Yeah,
you know, in terms of perspective.
Yeah. But this sort of celebration of fatherhood and the sort of this idea of lineage, right? I think is interesting, and it's something that, you know, connects to, I think, what photographers are doing today. This brings to mind very much work that Larry Cook has done, you know. So,
thank you.
Great, thank you, Alice, for that question. Thank you for the answers. Our next one here is from SL, and you should be able to unmute SL.
Hi, thank you for this just amazing discussion. I am just really I've been taking a really deep dive into Darrel Ellis. But I was curious if the notebooks point to sort of Ellis's interest in or attempts at more long format writing than his notes and notations about work and process. And also, as a second part to that, sorry to be greedy, who was Ellis reading? If anyone knows. Thank you.
Question. Leslie, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, those are both very interesting questions. He was reading a lot, from, you know, non-Western philosophy and literature to art history tomes. Not so much fiction from the kind of the bibliographies that are, you know, he was a non-fiction reader, I think, really more than a fiction reader. But, you know, in terms of the reveal any attempts at longer format writing, what exists in the notebooks, there are drafts of kind of artist statements and grant applications that are a few pages. We don't really have a notebook that itself is a short story or any kind of longer format writing, but he does talk about engaging in that. There's one point in the early notebooks where he talks about wanting to write a play that Miguel and Todd would participate in, where he would play Harriet Beecher Stowe in drag. So, you know, there's a lot in the notebooks where it's unclear if he actually realized the things that he was talking about. And there's, you know, it sort of points to a desire to do something. And, you know, maybe he did it and it just didn't survive, or perhaps he never got around to doing it.
Yeah, I just want to note that I think we realized recently that the artist statement was written by Alan Frame, correct, Alan?
Yes.
So
yes, it's had
a little help in there.
In the exhibition, it's in the vitrine, and it's funny because at the opening, a close friend of mine came up to me and said, "That artist statement, that's your handwriting. You wrote that." And I went and looked at it, and yes, I had actually seen it once before, but, you know, we were together and I was helping him write an artist statement. So I was just like, you know, playing with what he had said and writing it in my handwriting.
But what I would add to what Leslie said, which was pretty complete, but I would just say that his notebooks are they're very thorough and fragmentary. If you can take the dialectic here, he mixes like notes about his process with the annotation of a dream, and then he notes a list of things that he needs to buy for his diet, and he has little sketches of the I Ching. So it's really, it's almost like if you bear with me, it's a little bit like Walter Benjamin in the passages, you know, sort of, it's just little notes of here and there. It's very hard to say whether he had any plan to do anything more thorough with the more theoretical work. At the end, I think everything it's written in a first name basis. It's his experience. It's his kind of opinion. It's his take on this and that. So at the end, I think it's a diary. It's really a fantastic document of you know, of an artist growing up in the 70s and 80s.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Stacy, for that question so much. And our last question today, I'm just going to read, let's see, on behalf of Kenny Sullivan, who says, I was exposed to Ellis's work at the Bronx Museum and was quite moved. I'm curious, which specific Ellis works mean the most or speak the loudest to the participants?
I could start. Well, I'm fascinated what he did from my photographs, but particularly by the last painting that is the largest piece in his body of work, and it's in the exhibition. And what interests me is the degree of abstraction, the details that are left out in favor of a more painterly abstraction and the execution. And since it's a very late work, also making me speculate about what he might have done along those lines of having a figurative approach that is more abstract.
Leslie,
Sure. I mean, it's hard for me to answer. I think this was actually one of the hardest checklists I think I've ever had to do, because it really felt like killing your darlings in a really fundamental way. Like, you just knew that all of these works had a deep significance to him, and that, you know, there was a reason that these were images that were returned to over and over again. You know, the self-portraits, there's so much to say about the various self-portraits, and the I think there's something very fundamental and important about the way he reframed self-portraiture to be not exclusively about psychological interiority, but to be also a way of dealing with the projections other people made onto him. So, you know, to me, I think art historically, there's just a huge significance to that body of work, to thinking about how it departs from our paradigms of self-portraiture as a whole. But, you know, but there's also those interior scenes where he's thinking, and the way in which his mother, you know, like thinking about there's a lot of like matrilineality, I think, also in the images. And we've been talking about the relationship to the father, but to, you know, his grandmother, Honey, and and Lillian, and the way, that sense of culture being carried by women too is hugely significant in the work. So, and I think the bedroom scenes are sort of indicative of that. So I don't know. I can't really pick one. That's not a really good answer. Sorry.
I thought it was a great answer. I share the same difficulty. It's so hard. I pretty much fell in love with everything. I love to buy some work but I will make a choice, because I think for me it was very indicative, Leslie, of the process for us to go over this. So we knew about the photographs, we knew about the drawings, and we knew about this. And then all of a sudden at Candice, she brings this little canvas that it's the one based on Delacroix. and his sister had. So it's a beautiful painting, and we end the show with that. And we realized that it was very meaningful to him because in Alan's photograph of Darrel's in his studio, which I believe it's one of your last pictures of him, right, Alan?
Right.
You can see that painting in the background. So it's a painting that he carried with him, all the way close to his death. And it's a scene that relates to Hamlet at the grave of his father, and the grave digger hands him the skull of his father. So it's heartbreaking, it's very touching. But in another level also, it just tells me about how we have to protect art that we don't understand. I think his sister, she probably went to his house and said, oh, there is this kind of a mythological painting here or historical painting. I'll take it home. And she kept it for all these years. And there has been no discussion about it. And now it has become kind of a central point of discussion when we give tours, because it's a perfect way to finish the exhibition. So, and just another point, I know we're about running out of time, but this thing about protecting art, it's so amazing. And I think, again, I have to thank Alan for just holding all this stuff together for all these years and being the champion of his friend. But also, Susan Crowe told us in that panel that I mentioned a few minutes ago that years after Darrel died, I think she called you, Alan, and she said, listen, I have all these books here. What should I do with that? And it was the notebooks. So she had all the 50 few notebooks in a box that she salvaged from his studio. And she held on for years. And I think, in a sense, what we do in curatorial and art history and so forth, it's just trying to save all this material and bring to another time and share with people and make it resonate again. So, anyways, I'm running out of time here. So, but that's my perfect painting.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And yeah, this has just been incredible, or words don't really suffice. But here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our events with a poetry reading, and I'm so excited to welcome Tommye Blount here to the stage. Tommye Blount is the author of the chapbook What We Are Not For and the full-length collection of poetry Fantasia for the Man in Blue. He is the recipient of commendations, fellowships, and grants from the Whiting Foundation, Cave Canem, Breadloaf Writers Conference, among many others. Tommye lives in his hometown of Detroit, Michigan. Thank you so much for being here, Tommye. I'll turn it over to you.
It's my sincerest pleasure to be here. I cannot tell you how spoiled I have felt in this last hour, and how honored I am to be here. I had not, until Carolyn reached out to me to read, I had not heard of Darrel Ellis, and boy, am I glad that I know who he is now, and I am obsessed. So thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Ksenia. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Sergio. Truly. And thank you, Brooklyn Rail. Similar to Darrel Ellis, I have a poem in my book, Fantasia for the Man in Blue, in which I too kind of pick through the archives of my father in a way. I lost my father when I was 26. And so for years after his death, I would look at his autopsy report. At first, it was in a it was a kind of penance, I think, because of some feelings that I had around his death. And then over the years, it became just a way of me getting closer to him in a way that I wasn't able to when he was alive, like truly, right? With his body, right? Portrait of my father. Clothing consisted of blue corduroy slippers, blue and white striped boxer shorts, blue champion sweatpants, gray diabetic socks, gray thermal shirt, black with shocks of gray. There was a mustache and a beard. The scalp hair was curly and black with shocks of gray. White sclerae around brown irides, the eyes. Around the right eye, a contusion. The head was normocephalic. Dentition was natural, with several bottom teeth missing. There were no masses discernible in the neck. Larynx was in the midline. Thorax was symmetrical, unremarkable. The external genitalia were those of a normal adult uncircumcised male. A 1-inch circular scar was present on the right hip. There was a 9-inch curvilinear surgical scar on the left upper abdomen. Measured at 5 feet 11 inches in length and weighed at 139 pounds, the body was that of a developed Black male appearing about the recorded age of 56 years. The body was cool, rigor mortis long since waned. And so for this next poem, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully in an efficient manner. Okay. See if I can do this. Okay, this next poem was inspired by this photograph from Lyle Ashton Harris and Thomas Allen Harris in the series Brother, Crossroads, and Etc., number 2, 1994. And part of my challenge with writing a poem around this was to try and I was trying to sort of capture the complication, right? In the brotherhood that the Harris brothers were getting at, right? Which was teeming with queerness, complicated with queerness. And so I came up, well, I didn't come up with it, but I started writing in this form called a contrapuntal, which consists of 3 voices. Sorry, 3 voices. So you'll hear me read from the left side and you'll hear me read from the right side. And the third voice is the poem in itself. Brotherhood, Crossroads, and Etc., number 2, 1994, after Lyle Ashton and Thomas Allen Harris. At his guns insistent, my jaw goes slack. Call it a kiss? If this isn't love, then I will, willing to cross the distance, earn his favor. Afraid to let go, I lean into his body's bleak weapon. Why not trust this dark tunnel's burrow across the hate-wide distance between us? Yes, trust in my brother, God of the small destruction, for his aim is my aim, his arm, my arm. We can steady the gun's bright kiss of hello. It tickles me, but I'm too afraid to laugh and break this embrace. I do not like his body when it is seen from my body. And now, this accomplice, another death-hard brother, illegitimate sibling, silenced against me, muzzle to milk hollow tilt. Oh, Do I not long for my brother's hand in love of what came before this rage? Do I not love my brother enough to kill him before another brother can? Wouldn't I? Favor him if I were not ready to die by the hands of my brother's arms. No, I don't want to see what comes next. It's my mouth, not my eyes. I opened as if to sing, trust in my brother, God of small destruction, for his aim is my aim, his arm, my arm. We can steady the note low as the numbers of fingers it takes to tickle a bullet free. Why be afraid? Let him go. Don't I believe in this dark tunnel burrowing across the distance between us? My tongue busy with his tongue. I'm a quiet hostage who's given up. The gun holds my finger in its small O of betrothal, wedded in love of what came before this bothered blood. At his gun's insistence, my jaw goes slack. Do I not love my brother enough to call it a kiss? If this isn't love, then I will kill him before another brother can, willing to cross the distance, earn his favor. Afraid wouldn't I? Favor him if I were not ready to let go. I lean into his body's bleak weapon, to die by the hands of my brother's arms. Why not trust the dark tunnels burrow across? No, I don't want to see what comes next. The hate-wide distance between us. Yes, it's my mouth, not my eyes. I open as if to sing, trust in my brother, God of this small destruction, for his aim is my aim, his arm my arm. We can steady the gun's bright kiss of hello, the note low as the number of fingers it takes to tickle. It tickles me, but I'm too afraid to laugh a bullet free. Why be afraid and break this embrace? Let him go. Don't I believe I do not like his body when it is seen in this dark tunnel burrowing across the distance from my body? And now, this accomplice between us, my tongue busy with his tongue. I'm another death-hard brother, illegitimate sibling, silenced, a quiet hostage who's given up against me, muzzle to milk hollow tit. The gun holds my finger in its small O. Oh, do I not long for my brother's hand of betrothal, wedded in love of what came before this rage, this bothered blood. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Tommye, so much. That was just incredible. Such a really wonderful way to end things today. So thank you, and thank you to Sergio, thank you, Alan, thank you, Leslie, and Ksenia, of course. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program, making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. Today's conversation's been recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel and website shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a Rail poetry reading curated by Coralia Ahmed, featuring Ricky, Sally Zorker, and Adrian Howard. And as is Rail tradition, you can turn on your microphones, unmute, and say hello, goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much again, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
So much for the reading.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ksenia. Great reading, Tommye.
Yes.
Thank you, Tommye, for your reading.
Hi, Stacey. Can't wait to see you.
Great reading.
Thank you,
Thank
Ksenia.
Alan,
Thank you.
Sergio,
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Leslie. This was so amazing. Thanks.